live, and I gotta make sure. Ready? Going live. It says we're live.
And we are live. Are we actually on here?
Yes.
Am I live? So I got your emails. I got your phone calls even. You know, I wish you wouldn't call me at home, but you had to. So I got your phone calls. I got your emails. I got your letters and your DMs. You all said pretty much the same thing. We're really sick and tired of all these atheists boring us half to death. You know, it's always, how many babies can you eat? You don't have any evidence. I'm going to eat my babies. Can you please get us a Christian? So I said, John, you know what? Go get us a Christian. Matter of fact, John, get us the best Christian money can buy. Get us the best Christian YouTuber out there. And lo and behold, John did it. He scored us Michael. It's Jones, right? Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Michael Jones! Ah! Michael Jones! Ah! Michael, you want to introduce yourself? Welcome to my channel.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I run my own channel called Inspiring Philosophy, where we build apologetic videos defending Christianity, defending the faith, God's existence, anything related to that kind of issue.
Right. And as I was telling you, trying to earn some brownie points, but I actually mean it. It is probably, for my money, the best, if not actually the best Christian apologetic YouTube channel. It's at least one of the top 10. It's one of the ones that I go to all the time and use as a reference point because it's pretty thorough. I mean, you cover almost everything I can think of, just about. I build you as the man who knows everything.
Thanks.
You are welcome. So let's start at the beginning. Have you been a Christian your entire life, or did you have a period where you were questioning or struggling?
Oh yeah, I was. I'm an introvert, so I was like a closet, like maybe like not atheist, but maybe like deist type person. I didn't like, and it was emotional. I didn't really like Christians. I didn't like the church I went to. I got picked on there, and so I kind of went through this phase where I just didn't want to believe it and didn't like to believe it, and thought a lot of it was just kind of weird and overbearing. So I went through that phase in high school, a little bit after that, and when I was in the military. So I kind of, but I didn't really ever just come right back to. I didn't have like a come to Jesus moment. It was a slow, gradual process for me. And I jumped in and out of different camps, so it took a while.
Right, I heard you. I think on Engine's channel, you were raised Christian, and then you went through a period of searching. You were in the military, actually. That's pretty cool. And then you came back through kind of a process of intellectual arguments, if what I was understanding what you said correctly. You kind of read your way back into Christianity. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it definitely. I also watched a lot of like different lectures online. Or what kind of happened, it might just be luck or fate, but I was studying some arguments for atheists, and this was like pre-Zeitgeist time, but there was like, dial-up internet, we're just getting past that, but there was all like these old websites. It still had like Comic Sans, print and like purple backgrounds, but a lot of the websites I kept coming across were arguing Jesus didn't exist and was based on like Horus or like Dionysus.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But when I was in high school, I loved mythology. I think I still have some books from that time period. Yeah, I like really old books that I had, but I just loved reading about mythology. So when I was coming across these websites, I was like, this is wrong. This is so stupid, because I knew a lot of that stuff. So my idea of like atheism and at that moment was, it's just nonsense. They're historically illiterate when it comes to ancient mythologies. So that kind of encouraged me to read the Christian side. And then I think I got like the best of like the intellectual side, because I also came across people like C.S. Lewis and other more intellectual thinkers. And that kind of, maybe if I had found like Bart Ehrman instead of like these crazy websites, it may have been a different route. But that's kind of how I got where I'm at.
Right. I was actually, I'll give you a good compliment I saw on Twitter. No less than Paulogia, who I bill as the greatest atheist of all time, said if he had known Christians like you when he was struggling and he was still in his faith, he might have stayed a Christian. So there you go.
That's cool. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I've talked more to his, I think, girlfriend. Shannon Q.
Yes,
yeah,
girlfriend.
Shannon's great. We always have great conversations. She's a nice
Yes,
person.
Shannon's awesome. Shannon's awesome. She's been on the channel. Only once. She's got a channel. You got to come back on. Yeah, I saw you guys had that conversation about the soul, I think it was, for a couple hours on her channel. And I think that's the only thing I've seen with you. So
I was. Go ahead, yeah.
Let's jump to your Aaron Ra debate, okay? Let me preface it for you, and then I'll let you just expound. As far as I know, I've seen you debate this similar subject twice. Now, you debated it once against Matt Dillahunty. And there's one thing that you do that I love, the intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity. I think that's a really powerful paradigm, and it really sums up beautifully the difference between, like, we who genuinely practice our faith, the true Scotsman, and a different type of people who get blamed for all of the baggage of Christianity. And I thought with Matt Dillahunty, honest to God, you're the only Christian I've ever seen who I thought convincingly beat him in a debate. And I think he even acknowledged it. I mean, he wound up saying what he said to Jordan Peterson, which was, just because something is useful doesn't mean it's true, kind of acknowledging the point of the debate, that the sociological utility of religion. Now go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the extrinsic, intrinsic terms that I use, I didn't make that up. That's used like all the time in these psychological studies. I mean, it's just basic terminology among
right.
science.
No, I get that. It's just really effective. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is, because a lot of people just haven't heard of it on like the layman level. So it doesn't trickle down like it should. And so a lot of times when I debate people like Aaron Ra, they don't even know what I'm doing with these terms because they've not been in the literature as much. Like even in his most recent video where he did called What is Faith, he still, in his own terminology, doesn't understand the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. And so just to tell everyone what that is psychologists have thought for a while, like, okay, is religion beneficial? Does it give people benefits? Or is just people coming in community groups, using religion for community unity, or just to be a part of a group? Is that really what's beneficial? So they distinguish people. They say, okay, if you're extrinsically religious, you use religion as a means to an end. So you use religion to get community unity, or to feel like you're a part of a group, or to just sort of give yourself some sort of like community type purpose. If you're intrinsically religious, you're religious as it ends in and of itself. You're religious because you want to follow Christ, specifically Christianity. Right. You want to be a part of that religion as its core doctrines, what it believes. So that's the difference. And so they then just say, okay, well, let's just take these two groups and we'll separate them and we'll see what effects come out of them. And overwhelmingly, by and large, if you're intrinsically religious, it's associated with numerous positive effects, whereas extrinsically religious is associated with a lot of negative effects. So when atheists say things like, well, the only reason religion is beneficial is because when people get together in communities and they help each other, that makes people better people. And no, the studies of our scientists are much smarter than us. They've already looked at this stuff and they've already asked these questions, and they've shown in their studies that if you're extrinsically religious, it's associated with negative effects. Where if you're intrinsically religious, you're religious just for the sake of being religious. You want to follow God, or you want to get closer to God. That is actually what causes the positive benefits.
Right, but even in the Bible itself, Jesus differentiates between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who would be described as extrinsically religious. They want the big seats in the synagogue, and they're really about show and how holy I seem and how righteous I seem, versus the people who are actually trying to, how I describe it, is internalize the ideals of Christianity. I don't know if that's how you would say it.
Yeah, you kind of do see a little bit of that. I kind of get where you're going.
Okay. So, and then in terms of when you present the case with Matt Dillahunty, was really clear, because the debate was also, the debate was basically the point of what you were putting down. And as far as I can tell, almost all of the evidence that has anybody ever even challenged the evidence itself?
Yeah, well, not in live debate. I have had, conversations on Facebook or on comment sections about it, where some people will say, someone actually said after my debate with Aaron Ra, like, well, all of those studies you cited are just self-reported measures. No, that's a ridiculous argument. No one goes into a study and they go, are you extrinsically religious or intrinsically religious? They're going to look at you like you're crazy, because those are terms used in psychology. no one identifies under those terms. So they actually, what they do is they use something called a religious orientation scale, where they give you a questionnaire, and you don't put your name on it. So when you don't put your name on it, people feel more open to be honest on these type of questionnaires. And then you're supposed to just answer these very subtle questions. And then based on how you answer them, they will score you, and you'll be more extrinsically or intrinsically religious. So when people say it's all self-reported measures, that's just wrong. It's just that you can't. No one goes around reporting that they're extrinsic or intrinsic.
Right. Well, I mean, there's also a lot of common sense involved with, if any atheist is listening. I mean, they have Christians who they deal with, who they actually like, who they actually believe their beliefs and care about living, according to a Christian worldview. And then you have people who are just in your face, like hypocritical. And, it's really obvious the difference between people who are extrinsically, Christian for show or Christian to browbeat non-believers. It's pretty obvious between the difference, right?
Yeah. There was a study called the Religious Orientation Scale Review and Meta-Analysis of Social Desirability Effects. And they basically said in the study that, it seems that all of the negative things we see in society associated with religion, they tend to always be correlating in our studies with extrinsically religious people. Now, that doesn't mean every person who is extrinsically religious is bad, just like it doesn't mean every person who's intrinsically religious is good. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, regardless. But it just shows on the majority scale population, more people that are extrinsically religious are associated with things like higher rates of depression, extramarital affairs. There was a study done on racism which showed that because a lot of these people are extrinsically religious or so focused on the group, it can correlate with higher levels of racism, whereas intrinsically religious was the opposite correlation. So there's just some interesting correlations that sort of happen in there.
Right. Well, it's also true. Like, I'll give you two examples from the real world. Like with my wife, as we become more Christian, she's become much better of a person in terms of her character, like reaching out and helping other people. My brother-in-law, for example, came out to California. I bring this up a lot, but he came out to California and became a Christian on the spot because he was so impressed with the transformation in me. And the first thing everybody noticed about him back in New York was that he was much more concerned with the well-being of everybody else. Like some people take the actual admonitions of the scriptures, like, be a light into the world and do good to other people and things like that, too hard. You know what I mean?
Right.
Some people don't. For some people, that's really actually a big part of it. That's how I see it.
Yeah, you will see that. If you're going to use religion to sort of like get something out of it, like I'm doing it because I want a purpose in my community or if I want to be a part of a group, it seems to correlate with negative results. Whereas if you're intrinsically religious, you're going to church or you're just a Christian because you want to get closer to God, it seems to be correlated with positive results. And I tried to point this out in the debate with Aaron, and I don't think he still understands because of his recent video last week.
Well, he says he's been doing research for 20 years, but he seems to, what I pointed out in the video, I made 2 videos on your debate with him. And there's 2 things that he does. The first is the standard anti-theist. The Bible is a book of evil because there's these 50 scriptures that are terrible or debatably homophobic or whatever. But then they ignore like the 150 scriptures that tell you to love your neighbor as yourself, tell you to be merciful, things like that. And then he also seems to ignore all of the evidence that you found, the evidence that you presented in both of those debates. And he's been doing this for 20 years and somehow hasn't come upon any evidence that contradicts his opinion that religion is destructive. I mean, are you searching? Are you really looking? You found the evidence, right? I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make sure I don't try to psychoanalyze him or anything. But it's like it is kind of like a little suspicious. Like, how do you not find this stuff? It's like I went through a bunch of his videos before the debate, and I found him in his debate with Ken Hovind. And at one point, he says to Ken Hovind, "At this point in your career, you have no excuse for not knowing this." And I was like, I'm going to write that down because
use it on him. Exactly.
Going to come up. And it came up in the cross-examination. I had to point out, you said this to Ken Hovind, Aaron. Do you think it's fair for me to say this to you and you don't know this basic stuff? It's just basic definitions half the time. This is not complicated.
And so you actually used that line? What did he say? I
mean, I can't remember exactly what his reply was, but I'd have to go back and double check on that, but I do remember saying that to him, and then I don't think I remember not getting the adequate response or getting a direct answer on it, unfortunately.
Right, and the other thing is he's good in debates. I mean, I got to give him that. He speaks with force, and he speaks with conviction. And like when he does his Aaron Ross spiel, I can understand exactly why a certain type of person is like, yeah, go man, I'm totally into that, because he's really good at it.
He's a very good debater. He's very charismatic. I had one atheist, this is just kind of, it's almost like a backhanded compliment to our end, but one atheist told me after the debate, he's like, I felt like I fell into the Twilight Zone because you sounded more like the scientist and he sounded more like the fire and brimstone preacher. Like he was an atheist version of a preacher. And I was like, yeah, he's very charismatic. He's great at speaking. Outside of debates, he's a very likable and nice guy. I mean,
I noticed you seemed to bond with him before the debate. It seems like you guys were actually becoming like kind of friends. Is that true?
He's a cool guy. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about our agreements because I'm a theistic evolutionist. He obviously is an evolutionist. So we were talking about, I brought up I mentioned a study on abiogenesis recently, and we were talking about that. So we had some interesting talk with regards to that. And we both agreed that one atheist debater, I don't know if I should mention the name, but we both agree this one atheist is just bad at debates. So I mean, we had a lot of cool things to talk about.
I don't think you should mention his name. Who are we talking about? Who's that?
I'm not going to say. I don't. It's someone very much more famous than both of us. But
really, Shannon? Is it Shannon? No, it's not Shannon. Poor Shannon.
No. Shannon doesn't debate. No, it's someone who's debated people like Ken Hovind, and he's been on Joe Rogan before and all this stuff.
Okay, and he's more famous. How many debates have you done now in the past, how long have you been doing this? Because you seem to have debated everybody. And there's a lot of debates with you online. I mean, I went through about 4, and there are hundreds.
So on my channel, I recently did a playlist. So if you go to my channel, go to the playlist section, I list all my debates in a playlist there that I can remember. And I'm about 17 right now.
That's it? Wow. It seems like 100 when you look you up online. I saw because there are some that are 2 years ago.
There's a bunch of scattered interviews everywhere, but in terms of debates, I think I really only have about 17 or so. I think I might be missing 1 or 2 in there, but that's what I could find.
Now, any highlights of the terms of debate? Any observations on the atheists you debated, or word to the wise about debating people? Anything to say?
I mean, study your opponent. That's what I always tell people. Half the debate is knowing who you're going to debate. So if you watch my debate on my 2 debates on the Non Sequitur show, they were kind of back to back in terms of time. I debated Godless Engineer, then I debated Matt Dillahunty. And prior to both debates, I studied them psychologically, and I tried to figure out what they think confidence is, and then I project it back onto them. So if you watch my debate with GE, I'm smiling more. But if you watch my debate with Matt Dillahunty, I don't smile as much because I was trying to study what I think they understand as confidence. And then also know the subjects, know in and out, every person I'm going to debate, I pretend like they're the world expert on whatever it is, just so I'm ready and prepared for them, regardless if they bring up something. So a lot of debates I've been in, 75% of the material I had planned for, I didn't even get to use because I over-prepared. And that's always better than being under-prepared.
Yeah, it shows actually, because with the debate with Matt Dillahunty, that's the only time I've ever seen him lose a debate to a Christian. Every other time I've watched on YouTube, he kills the Christian. So, and I think that was you were dealing with the truth. Okay, he agreed to debate something where the truth is on our side, whether you think God exists or not. I say this a lot in my videos, but whether you think God exists or not, the evidence clearly points to the sociological utility of religion. So you're going to win that debate if you come prepared. I mean, right? If Matt has intellectual integrity, which he does kind of have, he started yielding to you. That's how I saw it. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, he had to yield the Gregory Paul study to me right away because I read that study before the debate. To be fair to Matt, though, I do remember him getting in that room, and I said, so have you just seen any of my videos to kind of know who I am? And he said, look, I just got off a plane. I'm exhausted. I've not had time to do anything. So I was like, okay. So he was underprepared. To be fair to him, but I mean, on the flip side, I would never do that to myself. I would never schedule things so close where I'm going to be exhausted for something. I mean, my debates are few and far between because I want to spend time prepping for that person.
Right, but I mean, if you watch most of his debates, he normally it's 100-3. He kills people. It's not even. He may be almost single-handedly the reason why so many people became atheists, because they watch him devastate someone in a debate. and it's not even close. So he probably he might not have even knew who you were. It's just like, oh, Christian, easy. Knock him up, I'll pull him down. And he's like, wait a minute, this guy's prepared? What's going on? This guy knows his facts? What's going on? I thought this was a Christian. I thought you signed me up with a Christian. Where's the dumb Christian?
That's another thing I love, is that I call myself a Christian apologist on purpose. I make that known. When people say, who am I debating? I say, you're debating a Christian apologist. Because
so they go, aha, dummy, I got him.
Exactly. Go because the atheist community has turned that phrase to mean stupid. And they throw it around constantly to mean stupid. So I throw that word out, and it immediately almost triggers something in their brain that I'm debating someone who doesn't know what they're talking about because he's just a Christian apologist. It almost catches them off guard sometimes, and that's what I want. So it kind of backfires because they've spent so much time turning that term into a derogatory term.
Right. No, it totally backfired. I 100% think that's what happened. Is he's like, oh, I'm debating a Christian apologist. He'll probably go, the earth is 6,000 years old. Because two kinds of animal on the ark or something like that. You're like, this would be really easy. I don't have to think about it. And then you came with like actual evidence. He's like, wait, what do you mean? Evidence? You're actually citing studies? What? I thought you were a Christian apologist. So that probably had a lot to do with it. Do you like Jordan Peterson, by the way? Do you watch him at all?
I haven't watched anything of his recently, so I need to be updated on it. But right now I'm studying a lot on Genesis and ancient monotheism because I want to do a series with regards to the claim that the Bible was originally polytheistic. So I'm reading a lot on that right now. Currently, I'm reading that book called In Search of God by Trygve Medinger. So I'm reading some of that stuff right now. So I've not actually been up to date on Jordan Peterson.
What do you consider yourself in terms of? I know you're not quite a Bible literalist. What's the term for how you view the Bible, and how would you describe how you view the Bible? Because I watched the debate with G-Man.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying that there were. I mean, go ahead. How do you view the Bible, and is there a term for your type of view?
I mean, I don't think there is because it depends on what we're looking at. I mean, I am a Christian, so I affirm all Christian doctrines, virgin birth, resurrection, second coming, all of that stuff. I am a theistic evolutionist. I'm a proud theistic evolutionist. I make no apologies about that. And I take the entire theory of evolution. So I don't have any qualms when it comes to Genesis. And that's the series I'm doing right now. On the next video, next week, I'll be uploading a video on Genesis 2 and explaining that the word rib doesn't show up in Genesis 2 when you read the Hebrew. It doesn't actually say Adam was made from dust. The preposition from is not in there. So I'm going to do a lot of explaining how I can rectify evolution in Genesis just by explaining Genesis in its original cultural context. So I don't know there's a term other than theistic evolutionist because, I also believe in a real Adam and Eve. So I'm going to explain how I am get to all of that. So, no, I don't know what the term would be for me. I mean, I'm a Christian that's a theistic evolutionist. This might be the easiest way to say it. But maybe when it comes to reading Genesis 1, I would say I'm a non-concordist.
A non-concordist, okay. Who are the people that are, you cite a bunch of people frequently as go-to sources or go-to authors. Is Michael Heiser one of them? Charles Taylor, I think you've mentioned Charles. Is by John Walton. John Walton. Okay, yes.
Old Testament scholar. I think he's phenomenal in explaining a lot of these things. He's got a great explanation of like Joshua 10 in his book, Ancient Near East or Old Testament Ancient Near Eastern Thought, where the sun allegedly stood still in the sky. It actually didn't. That's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew there. So John Walton, Michael Heiser. Who else? I mean, so many. Trygve Medinger, more liberal of a scholar, but. So a friend of mine on Facebook, Chris Hansen, he has his channel, Bible History Skeptics, has kind of got me on like a Trygve Medinger.
Oh yeah, I know Chris. I think John debated Chris. John, didn't you debate Chris? See you there,
John? Yeah. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. I did a debate with Chris on objective morality, and I think he definitely smoked me on that. It was my first.
I disagree. I think he killed him.
But yeah, I'm reading.
Yeah, Chris is great.
Medinger is a really good scholar. Oh yeah, he's Chris knows a lot. He actually sent me that book, so it's actually pretty good so far. So Medinger, Mark Smith is a pretty good Old Testament scholar. Again, more liberal. I don't know. I'm kind of drawing a blank. Gordon Wenham is really great. I do like Gordon Wenham. So yeah, there's a whole bunch that I would recommend. Paul Copan is not bad. Kenneth Matthews' commentary on Genesis is phenomenal. So yeah, there's a lot of different scholars, conservative and liberal, that I would recommend.
Cool. That's a good starting point for anybody who wants to check this stuff out thoroughly. You did have a debate with on objective morality that I watched with was it Cosmic Skeptic, I think.
Yeah, that was the first one. I had two, actually.
What's your take on that debate? That their arguments, the contrary argument on that, and how you see in that debate, how you see his argument and yours.
I don't, I think the argument, what he tries to do is it kind of avoids a lot of the obvious conclusions. Like at one point in the debate, I do remember saying, like, you're almost there. I almost got you to objective morality. And because he was admitting a lot of the things that I wanted him to say, and he was kind of following me down the path I wanted him. So I kept like setting up like these almost like breadcrumbs, like follow me this way, follow me. And he kept doing it. And then he just wouldn't cross the line into objective morality, which I think says a lot about the problems for like a more relativist or a non-cognitivist type view, is that it just doesn't align with the data as we know it. And so like one of my favorite philosophers on this is someone like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist. But he's just, the way he explains it in his books, like Mind and Cosmos, is just, it just, I think it captures what we mean when we talk about moral realism, that it actually is there and it's hard to deny its existence.
Right. I mean, even the people who argue for moral subjectivism, they don't live according to it. It's not what they teach their kids. They don't say like, oh, it's no big deal. With Cosmic Skeptic, his argument was frustrating, at least the part that I saw, because he was using the word skeptic in a way that was like more skeptical than you could possibly imagine. Like, I'm skeptical that there can even be such a thing as a moral claim. But then you were like, well, give me a good reason for that. And he wouldn't do it. He's like, I don't have to affirm that. And that's like, What on earth? What kind of slippery debate is this?
Yeah, it's coming back to me now. Yeah, I do remember some of that. Yeah, it's just, there's not a lot of good arguments for the other side, because, when you look at things like moral progress, moral experience, it just lines with a moral realistic view.
Right. And plus, that's why some of the big guns in atheism have started shifting towards moral realism and trying to justify it without God, like Sam Harris and Dillahunty.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of philosophers. Like I could, Ruth Schaefer Landau wrote an excellent book called Moral Realism. I have it here somewhere. Where did I put that? Yeah, this is one of my favorite books on moral realism. I thought it was phenomenal. Another great book on metaethics by Andrew Fisher. He doesn't take a particular view in his book, but he explains a lot of the views very well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So the other question I was going to ask you that you debate a lot. So you debate objective. What are the main things that you find yourself arguing? You're really, I think, pretty solid on the sociological utility of religion. That's how I define the debate with Aaron Ra and Matt Dillahunty. That's pretty much what you were arguing, correct? And then you've argued objective reality. What's some of the other debates that you're good at?
I debated someone named Tom Jump on Does God Exist?
Yeah.
That was, I mean, I had atheists who came out and said that I won that debate because he didn't come prepared and he was not ready for my arguments. I really was happy with that debate. I would like to do another debate on if God exists, a formal structured debate. I don't like to do open discussion because I want to present my arguments. I don't want to just have someone jumping in halfway through when I don't have time to get to the conclusion out. So I would like to do more of that in a structured format, maybe down the road sometime. Right now, I need to take a couple months off from debates because I am so behind on video creation. So I need to get back to
that. Because you put out a lot of videos. Didn't you just put out?
Well, that's the problem. I've been doing debates and trying to do videos at the same time. I'm getting kind of behind. And I need to do research because I want to do a 3-part series on ancient monotheism this winter. Plus, I want to get my Genesis series out there. So, and I still have 2 more videos to post this month because I've not posted my Patreon videos yet. Or videos I release early for all my Patreon supporters. So, but yeah, I've already posted 2 videos this month. But I haven't even done the videos I have to do. So.
Right. So you're behind on video. You debated Aaron Ra this month. You debated G-Man this month. You put out 2 videos this month. And this month is August. It's August 9th, isn't it? So.
Oh, no, I debated Aaron Ra back in June. G-Man was in August. So I didn't debate anyone in July.
Oh, okay. I guess I watched it recently. Okay, so the other question, you put out a video, at least one video I've seen on the problem of evil. Do you have more than one? I've only seen the one.
Well, kind of. So I have my video called "Does God Send People to Hell?" And I also have so it was kind of a series. I started with "Does God Send People to Hell?" Then I did a video called "What is Heaven?" where I explained heaven is not this fluffy resort in the sky that you're going to go to. Basically, when we die and go to heaven, we're going to have a lot of work to do. So I kind of explained that.
You hear that, John? It's not going to be a free ride, John. John's like, well, John's been telling me it's a free ride, man. You do whatever you want forever.
It's what saved right?
I don't think that at all. So I explained that. Then I did the hour-long video called "The Problem of Evil."
Right, so, that's the one I'm talking about. That's a really strong video. So go ahead.
Thank you. Oh yeah, I had that took me a while to write and create. Writing for it, as you probably know if you watched it, I kind of fell into several bouts of depression because when you're reading works by Holocaust survivors, it can get kind of depressing. I read a book by,
say the least.
I read Clay Jones's book on the problem of evil, and then from there I got some of the books that he sources in there to read as well, and then I kind of read all that, and I'm like, I think Clay Jones said it the best. I'm going to kind of just follow his outline and how he did it. So that's why I mentioned his book in the beginning, because he really is the inspiration for that video. I thought the way he kind of answers it, I think is the best way. And so I just sort of followed that. And so it took me a while to write that. I was really happy with it. I feel like for the most part, it does kind of address the problem of evil. I don't. What else do you want to know about it? I don't know.
What were the books the Holocaust books? Do you remember offhand?
I remember the authors. I'd have to look up the ebooks I have here, and they're so not organized right now.
It wasn't Primo Levi by any chance?
No, one was by a guy named Fred E. Katz, Katz. Another one was the Rape of Nanking, which is
yes.
I didn't even read all of that. I couldn't finish that. It was so hard. But it.
Yeah, Rape of Nanking. Me and a reading group went through all of that. That was actually from a Jordan Peterson recommendation, and that is that's a hard one to really get through. And then,
I would not want to be in his book club then.
No, there's quite a few other books like that. Like there's another one that's I guess kind of like a fictionalist biography called The Painted Bird, which is
Jerzy Kaczynski. Yeah. I read that.
Yeah,
that's supposedly a true story, but then he got caught.
Right.
That it's not a true story.
Yeah. So Rape of Nanking and Painted Bird are two of those kind of books that just like make you want to.
There's one called Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi, who was an Italian sent to Auschwitz. And it's really, really challenging to sit through. It'll make like every hair on your arm stand up. But it's well worth it. I mean, the guy won the Nobel Prize for Literature partially off of this book.
Yeah, I gotta just try to remember my sources for that. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
so what do you?
Hold on, I just wanted to add that Beverly channel, Beverly.me is the reading group channel that me and the other guys are going through, Jordan Peterson's group. Sorry, I just wanted to give that plug in while I was mentioning it. All right, go ahead, Craig.
No, it's fine. If anybody has good questions that are coming up as we speak, you can interrupt us and bring them out.
I've been keeping track of them.
So they're all stupid so far. Okay, good. So in Problem of Evil, what's your take on it? There are some people who say that's the best argument against God. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think it is the best argument against God's existence. I actually think it's the only one that's really kind of convincing, mainly because it has an emotional sting. I know some people like to use the problem of divine hiddenness, which might be a problem for specific religions, perhaps, but for God's existence, I mean, it's really hard to, because maybe it's just a deistic God that wants to hide. But I think the problem of evil is really the best argument against maybe the God of natural theology.
Right. And so how would you define your case in presenting the solution to it? Because go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, well, one thing I do think is you can't answer it from just a deistic or just a natural theology perspective. You got to take it from a Christian perspective, because if you don't, you're going to discount a lot of information that kind of goes into there. You cannot address the problem of evil the way a lot of people do. Like, maybe there's a good reason for suffering. You got to take it from the Christian worldview as, look, you got to look at it in the light of eternity. So we're going to live for eternity. So I've tended to use analogies when I use the problem of evil. So like one of the analogies I use is, think of when you were a child, when you were 3 years old. Do you remember how many times you cried? The obvious answer is no. You may not even remember any of the times you cried because you were 3, and that was a long time ago. Think of
that's a good point.
now in terms of eternity in heaven. Do you think it could have you think it's possible, at least, that the emotional sting or the hardship that evil has caused will be like it is now when you think back to all the pain you suffered when you were 3, that it's almost non-existent, it's all forgotten? And if Christianity is true, then that's what is promised, is that it will all basically be gone. Like, it'll be in the distant memory somewhere, but it will be eternity will dwarf it to the point where you won't even remember what it felt like or the hardships of it, because being with Christ in heaven will heal all wounds. So when people think of the problem of evil, they tend to discount eternity. Like, they just go, well, God let this child die. Yeah, but at the same time, it's not like he's rotting in the grave somewhere. That child is in heaven. So it's not like it's an end to everything there. And so I think that's one of the first analogies I use. The second analogy I've come to use is, imagine that we found out that in North Korea, they had built some super weapon that's going to wipe out all life on Earth. And we have an agent in there who's undercover and telling us where to bomb. The only problem is, he says, if we bomb it, it's also going to kill all the women and children that they have taken inside this bunker. And you go, well, and so the question is, if your hand is on the button, do you press it or not? Now, a lot of people kind of hesitate, and I go, okay, well, let me add something else to the analogy. Let's say we also developed a super technology where we can bring everyone in that bunker back to life in brand new bodies. Now, it's just going to take about 200 years to build them, these new bodies, because it takes a while to build a human body. Would you push the button? And the obvious answer is yes. Now, that's what Christianity is kind of teaching. Although there might be some present suffering, it is better to have that present suffering because the alternative would be far worse. And at the end, everyone gets to come back who wants to come back, just in a brand new, glorified, eternal body. And so when you look at it in that perspective, it's kind of like the analogy. Not everyone is it's not as bad as some people think about it in terms of that, because people are always discounting eternity, the resurrection, when it comes to the problem of evil. So we need to address it in terms of Christian eternity, the resurrection, not just look at it from in the current present perspective with the pain, suffering, and death, and without the idea of heaven and eternity involved. Right,
because you're saying, how could God allowing this? There's no redemptive purpose to this. And for the first thing you said, there's even a scripture, I don't think the sufferings of this present time are worthy to be compared with the glory to be revealed in us. And that's a really good analogy, that like, you don't remember when you fell down and scraped your knee when you were 5, in light of the life you've lived past. The little evil the Christian scripture is pretty clear. The little evil visited upon you now is nothing compared to where you are headed for, and where there's no evil, no sickness, no sorrow, and no suffering.
Yeah, so I talk about that more in my video on heaven, where I kind of explain that more. So before I did the problem of evil, I did a video on hell and heaven, because I thought those needed to be established before I went into that, because typically when you bring up the problem of evil and you try to address that, people inevitably go to the problem of hell. So I had to make sure I did that prior to the video on evil.
So what's your take on I don't think I saw your hell video. So that comes up a lot with atheists. A lot of them were ex-fundamentalists who have been preached hellfire and brimstone ad infinitum. Some of them even, I think Cosmic Skeptic has a video, Why I'm Still Afraid of Hell, as an atheist. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think hell is so I take C.S. Lewis's view. I don't think hell is like a torture chamber people are thrown into against their will, and they're climbing up the sides going, please, no, let me out. And God's like, no, it's too late now.
It's too late. going while he's burning them forever.
Yeah, hell is a freely chosen identity built on something else besides God going on forever. Hell is a freely chosen identity built on something else besides God going on forever. So C.S. Lewis just says, all that are in hell choose it. So hell is basically a place where people who hate God go to because they don't want to submit to him. They don't want to surrender to him. So they just go to hell where they can try to build their own kingdom. And if Christianity is true, that will ultimately fail and collapse. And so that's what hell is. Hell is just the outer abyss. It's where people, when they leave the light of God, they go to the outer abyss, metaphorically speaking, I guess you could say, instead of being with God. So all that are in hell choose it. Everyone is welcome in heaven, but people go to hell because they hate God.
So how do atheists react? Have atheists ever, have you brought that up to an atheist, that particular view? How do they respond to it?
Some atheists say they basically agree that they would rather be in hell. And so I was I was on, I think the channel was like bridge.tv. It's a guy out of Egypt who was interviewing me. He's a deist. But he basically said, like, if it turns out your God is real, I don't want to go to heaven. And I'm like, yeah, that's what hell is. That's the point. I mean, you're proving my point. It's like,
right.
You think God is so evil, you want to be him and be with him. And that's what hell is, and hell is a freely chosen identity where you just reject God.
Yeah. I think Christopher Hitchens said something about that. Like he thought God was such a moral monster that he'd rather be in hell just to hold on to his moral positions.
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Yeah, I quoted Christopher Hitchens in the video, so yeah.
Oh, did you really? Wow, that's hilarious. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the basis of a lot of the atheist arguments. That's the whole point of taking out some scriptures. Go, look, God is a moral monster, is to posit yourself as, more righteous than God. Which, if we are actually if you and I are actually correct and God exists, the idea that I, the human, am more righteous than the author of justice and righteousness is totally absurd. I mean, if you think about it that way, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, true. I mean, you could argue that maybe he's not a moral God and you think you're better than him, but you better make sure you're right on that then. But that's an interesting question in and of itself. If God is the basis for good. So when I did my series on ethics, I actually did 2 videos arguing that he is.
Go ahead. Tell us.
Okay, well, I did a basic video called The Moral Argument, and I just presented basically that, I did a second follow-up video where I presented more arguments that God is the good. So what I mean by that is when we talk about the highest moral good, that is just God. And so it's not that the good is based on God, God is the good in that sense. So I kind of just, so what I did in the second video is I just pointed out that when we think of what the moral good is, it is personal in how it manifests. So it's just take one of the arguments from that video, prescriptions. So if objective morality is true and moral realism is true, then there are true objective moral prescriptions. That's different than like logical descriptions, because prescriptions have to come from a prescriber. So you just have to think, okay, well then there's a personal aspect to moral realism, to these moral prescriptions that are handed down to us. They have to be prescribed to us. They just can't be descriptions inherent within the universe, like logic or physics could be, I guess you could say in some sense. And then think of something like the moral ideal. We can talk about a being the moral ideal, but it doesn't really make sense to say there's something that's a moral ideal that's just some sort of abstract concept out there. So I explained it in more detail in that video, and I think I gave about 4 arguments for that.
And so what's the general response to that? I'm curious. You get a decent amount of views on your videos and a lot of comments. How much of that are you able to process and get through?
I mean, I used to get through it more. I can't do it anymore as much as I want to. But I do still read some of the comments, but I just don't have time to go through them all, especially with the
because honestly, I struggle with Buzz. Buzz comments on like every video, and like I struggle with John and Buzz. They'll comment on almost everything. I'm like, okay, that's a long answer. Other than that, there's like maybe 5 comments in each video, and I sometimes can't even get to that. So I can't even imagine how because sometimes I'll see like 300 comments on your videos, and some of them are from people who are really committed to the answer. It's pretty in depth. And I wouldn't necessarily want to not read that, but there's no way I'd have time. You know, I barely have time to read I barely have time to read people's tweets.
I don't have time. I mean, if I'm going to keep making videos, I just don't have time. It's one or the other. So I just can't. It's unfortunate. But what I try to do is I try to read more of like the atheist philosophers or the atheist scholars to get those kind of objections. Sometimes I will still go into the comment section and respond to people because it is good to sort of like, you know, refine my arguments that way to sort of better understand them, just to see what the objections are. So I still try to do some of that. You know, I do what I can. It's hard, but you know.
Do you get atheist scholars? Do you get like fairly well-known people who like email you or try to engage you directly on stuff that you put out on your content, or you're like does Matt Dillahunty sometimes DM you and go, you know, this video is stupid?
No, we don't. No one talks to each other. If they do, they don't talk to me. I don't.
Oh, really?
No, I don't know. I don't get messages like that.
Because atheists say that all the time. They say they get, you know, I guess they mean something different. But so you don't. Nobody like fairly well known tries to go. The point you made here isn't correct because of X, Y, Z, P, to Q. Okay.
I will get some messages like that, but it's not from like really popular atheists. It's just like these, you know, people that don't have a YouTube channel. They're just watching a video and they want to send me a message. And so I try to read more of the messages I get, but I don't have time to respond to every message I get because like the other morning I woke up and I had 40 in my inbox. I mean, I can't respond to everybody.
Right. I was just curious because you're pretty far up the food chain in terms of, you know, how big your channel is and how many people know about you. So I thought your views might be pretty well known in the atheist community. I wasn't sure, but you know, you're pretty far up the food chain. You've debated a decent amount of the well-known atheists. So,
yeah, I don't know. If they do, then maybe they're using a different name. I don't know.
Yeah, could be. I was just curious. Wasn't sure. All right. So the other thing I was going to ask you about, the end of materialism. You had a whole series on the emergent universe, and go whatever you want to tell us about it. I thought that series was really interesting. It's something. What I'm starting to look into now, just recently, is like quantum mechanics and its application to what we do. And I think, like there's two areas that I think are really fruitful for us, the Christian apologists: the intrinsic, extrinsic religiosity, sociological utility of religion, and the emergent quantum mechanics, emergent universe type arguments. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think that a lot of the evidence coming out of quantum mechanics, modern cosmology, is just really strengthening the theistic arguments. So like I rely on a lot of data from people like Sean Carroll. Like it's kind of ironic to me because a lot of the stuff he's saying, I'm going, well, that makes a good argument for God's existence. Let me show you what, where, and how. Because what they're doing is they're arguing that a lot of the data is showing that space-time, classical space-time as we have it, is emergent from some more underlying fundamental reality that's spaceless and timeless. So,
gee, what does that sound like? I wonder what that could be. Spaceless, timeless, and reality that all creation emerges out of. Doesn't sound like anything I could think of. Go ahead.
Well, exactly. But it's also kind of interesting because I'm connecting the dots from other areas as well. So what they're saying is that space-time would emerge from this underlying wave function extended through Hilbert space. Now, Hilbert space isn't really space. Sean Carroll says it's just like math speak. It's information. So space-time emerges from, in a colloquial sense, underlying information. So there was the wave function extended in Hilbert space. The interesting thing about it is another physicist named Diedrich Ertz has been arguing that the properties of the mind can be readily modeled using that exact same language, like Hilbert space, the wave function, quantum collapse. That how we explain how the mind works should be explained in quantum terms. Okay, then if you just connect the dots, it seems like if you take what Diedrich Ertz is saying and you take what Sean Carroll is saying and combine it, you're basically saying that the universe emerges from something that is mind-like.
Right.
So then just take the next step forward with just one more inference that the universe is emergent from a mind. And so when I did a video last year called The Emergent Universe, and I just laid out all the data that I had in there. I couldn't do it in one video. I did two videos, really. I did a video called The Death of Materialism, and then another video called The Emergent Universe, where I just laid out a lot of the data that shows that the universe is emergent from something mental. So at this point, the contingency argument, it just strengthens the contingency argument to the point where you're starting to recognize the mental aspects of it. Because when Matt Dillahunty debates the cosmological argument, he says, sure, the universe came from something, but we don't have enough information to suggest what it came from. We don't know. So my videos say, yes, we do. It's mental. It's mind-like. It's basically some sort of like mental type structure, some sort of mind or some sort of being. That's what the evidence suggests, especially in this new data that I presented. So it just makes the cosmological arguments far superior than they were.
And you're an idealist, right? Like that's how you described yourself in your conversation with Shannon. So would that make sense then of everything emerging from like an information, like metaphysical fundamental reality, that all reality is based up out of information or mental qualities, like qualia?
Yeah, everything but consciousness. I would say consciousness is fun. I don't think our consciousness emerges from some sort of like more fundamental thing or anything like that. I think consciousness is fundamental. I basically say I'm basically the same as a substance dualist. I just say cut out the substance. It's all one substance, but there's a dual aspect there. So I call myself a dual aspect idealist. So you have mind and matter. It's almost, it's all one substance, but there is clearly an epistemic distinction there from the information that matter is versus what the conscious mind is.
So I guess connecting to that then, would that mean that if a tree were to fall in a forest, but there were no conscious creatures around it to experience it, would that mean that the tree itself doesn't come to have been fallen until some conscious creature interacts with it in some way?
In one sense, yes. In one sense, no. So the physical appearance of that tree falling didn't happen, but the information is still there, just waiting to be collapsed by the observer. So you got to think of it in terms of like a video game. If you start like an RPG video game, when you turn on the video game, it's going to upload a backstory for your character. He didn't just pop into existence there, like maybe he grew up in the slums and now he's fighting for a soldier or something, I'm thinking of Final Fantasy VII. So he's got some backstory there. Now it's still there and it's really real in that world to the characters there, but you, the observer, it doesn't really collapse into the physical appearance on the screen until you turn on the game. So you got to think of it. So I use that analogy of the video game to sort of explain what I mean by it.
I see. So kind of like in Minecraft, where there's chunks that are only loaded when there's a player in that area, except for the server chunks where you're starting. And then the actual visual components of the chunks don't actually load until your cursor is like facing that direction. It's all just information besides that.
Yeah, it's all information, and then it physically collapses to what it is when the observer is there. So if you play a video game and you go into a room, the room is there, and then you turn around and leave the room, is the room still there? Well, yes and no. The information that uploads the room is there, but it's not physically appearing on your screen. So think of the world in terms of that, and that's the analogy I'm trying to get at.
I see. So would that mean that, I guess, subjective experiences would be just as real as objective reality? So like we can make sure that a table is real because like we have pressure when we touch against it. Would that mean that other experiences like subjective pain or pleasures would be almost just as real as our objective sense of reality?
Yeah, they would be real. And I think, you think of it in terms of this, just in a basic philosophical sense. Everything you experience is mental. You experience pain. You experience qualia, visual intake. But all of that is mental. Everything you're experiencing is a mental world. So the idealist just says, why posit a physical substance beyond that when everything we're experiencing is the information of a mental world? Because, colors don't exist in the real world. It only happens when certain wavelengths hit the eye and it translates it into the brain on the materialist side into color. Well, the idealist just says, let's just cut out the middleman. It's just what we are experiencing really is a mental world.
Right.
And that's why it appears mental.
Kind of like using Occam's razor then to just shave out all unnecessary points to that.
Exactly.
So then couldn't that, like, still from the materialist idea, be like running off of a computer simulation in some like meta universe? Like our universe was created through the Big Bang, and all of our time, space, and matter are only information that's running off of some server outside of our universe.
Yeah. And I don't see why that's a problem for theism. I mean, it kind of is what theists are almost getting at. But some do posit that. They posit the simulation theory. So someone like Brian Whitworth wrote a paper on this, and he argued that, we should probably just think of ourselves as just some sort of simulation running off of some future society's computer.
Right.
And there's the same thing behind Nick Bostrom. I think it's Bostrom.
Yeah, Nick Bostrom.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's a simulation.
Yeah, it's simulation argument. Yeah.
Now, the one thing I worry a bit about that from a theistic Christian perspective is that this kind of introduces the problems of like Gnosticism, where the creator of the universe isn't the omnibenevolent being. It's instead some sort of demiurge or just some Joe Schmo scientists that decided to create a universe in which there's tons of suffering or evils that occur.
Right. Well, that's possible, and we shouldn't discount it as a possibility. So first of all, that's why I uploaded my video called The Emergent Universe, where I argue that it's far more likely we're emergent on a mind itself than a computer server, because the aspects of the underlying reality are far more similar to a mind than they would be to some sort of computer. Right. And then the second thing to remember is with these types of arguments, we only can get to a deistic God. Beyond that, we need to argue for Christianity, and we use like the resurrection argument, the reliability of the New Testament, the reliability of the Old Testament, these types of things to get to that, sort of build a cumulative case for Christianity from those different areas. So you don't get to that omnibenevolent God from these arguments. Now you can if you use the moral argument, because the moral argument would, in conjunction with the emergent argument, I guess you could call it, would get an omnibenevolent, would say we are contingent upon an omnibenevolent mind. So you could get to at least a benevolent mind from the moral argument and the emergent argument.
I see. By just kind of connecting the metaphysical reality that's sustaining our universe to the same metaphysical reality that makes things have moral qualities to them.
Right.
Or adds the prescriptive qualities. All right. Sorry to barge in there, Craig. I just wanted
that was cool. Those were actually interesting questions. I have a question related to Gnosticism. You might not know this, but this is something that occurred to me. You've done a lot of background research on the different, I'm just assuming you know this better than I do, like Arminianism, Gnosticism, things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so
yeah, I've looked into Gnosticism a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so here's my question about Gnosticism, and you might not know the answer. It seems to me now, like we sort of, when they talk about Gnosticism as a hearsay of Christianity, do you think the Gnostics actually believed Gnosticism, like the world was created by a demiurge or run by a demiurge, or do you think they saw it as a kind of analogy? And they were using it as a sort of enacted analogy. It's like we literally believe that Jesus is God. Do you think the Gnostics literally believed in their cosmology, or do they just kind of take it as a way of explaining things that kind of was cool and interesting? Does that question make sense?
It makes sense, but that's a difficult question because there was no ancient group that called themselves the Gnostics. There were different groups that modern scholars have labeled the Gnostics. So like the Valentinianism, there's Saturnalians, the Sethians, the Canaanites, or all these different various groups that we call Gnostic sects. So, and they would even differ depending on what group you were in. So there was all these different types of groups. Some of them may have looked at it like metaphorical. Yeah. Some probably actually did. You also have to think of something like the Gospel of Thomas. The very few manuscripts we have of that vary widely. So it seems like it was more of like an evolving tradition, unlike the New Testament Gospels that we have, where they were more pretty strict, keep the doctrine idea. The Gnostics,
have you read any of the Apocrypha? Any of the, like the Gospel of Thomas?
Oh, I did a whole video on Thomas.
Oh, you did? Oh, wow, I missed that.
I did a video on I did a video on the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas, 2 separate videos.
And what about what's the one Matt Dillon talks about? The Gospel of Peter. That I think it almost made it into the Bible, correct?
No, it didn't almost make it into the Bible. I mean, if you look at the early church fathers and the books they allude to or attest to, Peter rarely comes up. The Gospel of Peter is clearly a much later developed idea where Jesus sort of comes out of the tomb in front of the Pharisees and everyone, and then like 100-foot cross comes out and is talking. I mean, it's clearly like embellished by far. So there, in terms of like the early church fathers, not a lot really put a lot of credence to it. Some did, but not all.
Okay. Now, is the common scholarship or the common knowledge of how accurate would you say the atheist stuff that floats around YouTube? I know this depends really, but like, for example, Bart Ehrman. I mean, how well do you rank as just as baseline scholarship?
Well, Bart Ehrman, I think, is a good scholar. I mean, he's one of the first people who studied Gospel of Judas. He's got a lot of great work on that. He would flat out say this is not a first century document. It's late second century, maybe even into the third century. So in terms of scholarship, I think, he does a lot of good work. I disagree with a lot of his arguments with regards to the New Testament, because sometimes, I did in my series on the New Testament in part 7, I did answering objections. And one of, I kind of showed a contradiction in one of Bart Ehrman's constant claims where he says, the New Testament could not have been written by these illiterate fishermen from Galilee. And then I got another clip of him telling, this Jesus mysticist that everyone in the ancient world wrote via a scribe. Okay, well, if everyone wrote via a scribe, they didn't need to know how to read or write. They could just dictate to a scribe. They just needed to know how to talk. So, right. I think sometimes he's uncharitable and kind of contradicts himself depending on who he's talking to. But I mean, I don't have anything personally against him. I think he does a lot of really interesting scholarly work.
Well, he had the whole. I read his. The last book I read of his was what was the one? Not the Triumph of Christianity. I haven't gotten that one yet. The other one about how Jesus became God, I think it's called. And there's a lot of really sketchy. I mean, the underlying scholarship is probably correct. I have no way of really knowing that because I'm not well versed enough. But there's a lot of really, just from the surface of what I know about reading the Bible myself, there were a lot of really sketchy claims. A lot of stuff was like, well, there's a whole, I guess, scholarly idea that the book of John was somewhat doctored up after the fact to make Jesus more godlike, to clarify Jesus, the I am statements, the 8 I am statements. What do you make of just that leg of it? Is that a true thing or is that debatable?
It's kind of ironic. I would quote Robert Price here, who doesn't even believe Jesus existed, but he makes a really good point that a lot of what these scholars do is they already have a conclusion of what Jesus or who Jesus was.
Right. That's exactly. Yes. It's agenda scholarship with Ehrman for sure.
Yeah. Everything I put in category 1 is what Jesus said, because that fits the mold of Jesus I already have. And everything I put in category 2 had to be added by the later church. And so, no.
The part about it that just even as a layman was obvious to me, and being a layman, I'm not sure if I'm right, but in the book of Matthew, for example, Jesus doesn't necessarily have the I am statements, but he makes it pretty clear that he's the authority on what the Old Testament, he makes his role pretty crystal clear in the book of Luke and the book of Matthew. Book of Luke, he's like, this scripture is fulfilled in your saying. Now, they'll probably debate whether he said that. Go ahead.
You probably read that book behind me, because he actually kind of goes over some of the I am statements that Jesus made. And there are some in the synoptic gospels. So like when Jesus is walking on the water, he says, "Fear not, I am."
Right. So but he's also pretty in the synoptic gospels. It's not exactly like he's like Bart Ehrman kind of paints it like in the synoptic gospels, it's a totally different character almost, and it isn't. It still sounds like the same voice. He still presents himself as authority on the scriptures and the fulfillment of the scriptures. It's not quite. Go ahead.
One of the things Jesus always goes around doing is he keeps saying to people that he's healing is he says, "Your sins are forgiven," and we go, "Oh, that's
exactly."
So but Jesus is actually.
Thank you. That's so nice. Go ahead.
You know, what he's actually doing is that he's quoting Jeremiah 31, where God tells Jeremiah that when I established a new covenant, then I will heal their land and I will forgive their sins. So God is going to forgive their sins. Jesus keeps going around saying, your sins are forgiven. What is he saying? He's saying, I am God and I am now establishing the new covenant that Jeremiah prophesied about. So every time he says that, he is saying the new covenant now begins. I'm here to give you the new covenant, and only God can give the covenant. So he's very subtle because he doesn't want to be stoned, but he's very subtle. He constantly keeps saying that, you know, he makes these like little allusions that he is Yahweh. So that happens a lot in the synoptics. And so if you understand the synoptic gospels with the Jewish background, you see, I mean, he claims to be God all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was making. You don't even have to have that big a deep a knowledge to see in like the book of Matthew how clearly he is presenting himself as, you know, it's really clear. It's not like
just in Matthew 28:18, it says, then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's kind of like far from subtle. That's
right. And even like the Sermon on the Mount, I say to you this day, you know, you've heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I say to you, if somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Okay, so he's telling himself he's the authority on what the Old Testament's. He's clearly presenting himself in a role. That's all I was trying to say. Whether he specifies it as clearly as he does in the book of John, how valid is something like the Jesus Seminar? Do you know what that is, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, they have been critiqued a lot by conservatives and even people like Robert Price, who just saying like, you've constructed these versions of Jesus already in your mind, and then you just go out and you find the verses to fit it, and then any verse that doesn't fit it had to have been added later. And I don't think they deal with a lot of the arguments from the internal evidence. So Lydia McGrew recently wrote a book about that for the undesigned coincidences in the Gospels. There's also a lot of evidence of dissimilarity. There's passages that meet criteria of embarrassment.
Undesigned coincidences. That's an interesting word. What does she mean by that? Because that's potentially really game changing. Go ahead.
So if you think of like, if you were going to get a story about my brother and you talk to me and my mother, if a good way to know we're not making it up is if we kind of fill in the gaps in each other's stories. So if you check out my video, The Reliability of the New Testament, part 6, I kind of go over some undesigned coincidences in there. So like, for example, one part in one gospel, Jesus turns to Philip at the feeding of the 5,000 and goes, what should we feed them? And you go, well, why is he turning to Philip? That doesn't make sense. It's never explained in that gospel. You have to go to a different gospel and find out that Philip lived in that region. So that it makes sense for Jesus to turn to Philip of all the 12 and ask him this question because he lived in that region. If you look at how Pilate talks to Jesus, the different gospels fill in the details that sort of like build on each other, sort of make it all make sense and explain it. So it's like the opposite of alleged contradictions. These are different details that sort of like fill in the gaps for each gospel.
Right. There are details. Right. There are some details that, like, for example, even if you go back to Abraham, you know, people love to talk about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. Like, it's so mean and why would God do that? But they don't even notice the fact that nobody disputes that was in the Old Testament long before Jesus. And it's clearly indicating the sacrifice of a son. I mean, it's like, you know, it couldn't be more clear. You know what I'm saying? And there's nobody on earth who disputes that was there in the Old Testament. Like, someone will dispute, I think they will dispute Isaiah 53. What's the dispute on that exactly? You probably know better than I.
The Jewish idea is that it's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about
the nation of Israel. Right.
There's different theories. You know, and so one thing we also have to remember, though, is a lot of the prophecies of the Old Testament were vague on purpose. So at one point, Paul says in 1 Corinthians that if the archons, the rulers of the world, would have known what was going to happen, they would not have crucified the Lord. So they would not have crucified Jesus if they would have known. So a lot of the prophecies from the Old Testament were vague on purpose to have this mystery that would have one day be revealed. So we need to keep that in mind as Christians. We can't put too much emphasis on this. Now, I would agree there's a lot of really good prophecies in the Old Testament that refer to the Messiah being a man and being, you know, a son of David, but also being God. You can sort of piece them together. But they were also vague on purpose for a good reason.
Right. I'm just talking, okay, so meta-narrative, though. Even if you don't believe in Christianity, it's pretty crystal clear that the Old Testament is a messianic religion, and they are talking about a somebody to come who's going to fulfill the book. The Jews today are looking for a Messiah. They just don't think it's Jesus. So nobody disputes that it's a messianic tradition, and nobody really should be disputing that Jesus presented himself, even in the Synoptic Gospels, as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. Mm-hmm. Whether you believe it or not, that's what's being put forth by the characters in the book. The characters. Right. When Spider-Man says that he's Spider-Man and nobody so that's my only objection to Bart Ehrman. It's like his whole point is that Jesus didn't view himself as God in the Synoptic Gospels. And if you read the Synoptic Gospels, even as a layman, it's really obvious that he did. That he viewed himself as the fulfillment of the scriptures. So I'd have to talk to Ehrman to get it hashed out more clearly. Mm-hmm. But as far as I can see, it's not true.
Yeah.
So even if you don't believe that Jesus is God, it's pretty clear that he presented himself as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. The Synoptic. And he knew the tradition that he was presenting himself as the fulfillment of, and he knew it well. So he wasn't using accidental choice of words and things. What about the mythicists? Right. Did you actually, what'd you debate Godless Engineer on? Did you debate him on whether Jesus existed or not? Or
Yep, I sure did. I debated him if Jesus existed, and boy, was that fun. He was not prepared.
Really?
No.
Okay, so tell us give us the lowdown.
Well, as I said, I try to study people before I debate him, and he made the mistake of basically telling me a lot of the stuff he said because he posted it on his Twitter or on his Facebook. But prior to the debate, he noted on Twitter that he was going to watch my series on the New Testament. And I said, okay, well, that's what he's going to think I'm going to be arguing from. I'm not going to use any of that. I'm going to use completely different arguments. And then also prior to the debate, I think like a couple days before, he did a whole live stream on Facebook attacking the passage in Tacitus. So I knew all of his arguments about the Tacitus passage. So guess what I primarily used in that debate? It was the Tacitus passage. And the debate started with him. He always kept saying this line up to this point. He never used this after the debate, but he kept saying in the Tacitus passage, it doesn't say Christ. The I is actually missing in the word for Christ. So I went and found a photocopy of that exact page and showed him the I in the debate live after he made that argument. And then I just basically went through all the arguments why we know this passage is authentic, why we know that passages in Josephus are authentic. And you just got to read the comments. It's not good in his favor.
What is the gist of I listened to a couple of Carrier. I listened to a couple of his videos on Jesus not being, it's really bizarre because the gist of a lot of his arguments, as far as I can tell, I'm not, again, this is just a first glance. I only listened to it a few times. As far as I can tell is it's scriptural based. Like he'll tell you on one hand, you can't trust the Bible, but a lot of his claims that there was this like group of, I can't even tell what his theory is exactly, but it's really out there. But it's based really on the scripture too. It's based on like, go ahead.
Well, I was talking to Chris Hansen. Chris Hansen's been going through some of his work and finding that some of the sources or places he's citing don't really line up. So he's going to be doing some stuff on that soon, hopefully, and I'm going to help promote it because, there's a lot of problems in Carrier's book. But Carrier hinges a lot of his work on something called the Ascension of Isaiah. This is a work that was probably written maybe around 100 AD, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after. It talks about the Messiah coming down from like the different layers of heaven, disguised. Right.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm totally on the same page. Go ahead.
So he thinks that's a mysticist work because he thinks Jesus never gets to earth. He just does everything on the firmament. But then on page 43 of his big book on the historicity of Jesus, Carrier even has to admit, this work does mention a brief sojourn to earth. Okay, so the sojourn to earth.
So it totally undercuts your entire argument.
And that's the entire argument, yeah.
And then he does this thing where he points out to, I think, 1 Corinthians 15, where he's saying Paul is talking about a Jesus that's ethereal Jesus, an angel of the Lord. I'm like, what on earth?
It doesn't make any sense because resurrection, Paul uses the word resurrection, anastasis, which up until that point, before the Gnostics, it always meant a bodily return to existence when you were talking about a person. It never meant some sort of spiritual existence or some sort of Gnostic type view. It meant a bodily return to life. And so it's so obvious in that. Even Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist and doesn't think that Jesus rose from the dead, admits Paul is talking about a physical resurrection here. That's what Paul thought happened. And so I don't understand scholars that try to say that's not what Paul's talking about.
Well, and then the other thing that Carrier did was he said he gave the odds that he's correct. And at first he goes, if you look at it one way, there's a 30% chance that Jesus lived. If you look at it another way, it's 1 in 10,000. Like, who's the odds maker here? You? Okay, that's interesting. It's so funny.
His work on he does Bayes' theorem, and that's don't even get me into his problems with Bayes' theorem because he abuses that left and right. But I mean, a lot of Christians do as well, and I would call them out for the same reasons.
Well, okay. So, do you get in run-ins with Christian scholars? Or Christian? Are there people who protest you? Christians who like
Kent Hovind?
Yeah, Kent Hovind is. Well, his fans don't like me a lot. Kent Hovind is too busy building his dinosaur Adventureland to really come after me or anything. But yeah.
And what's their beef with you? Too lukewarm, too wussy Christian, too intellectual?
I'm a theistic evolutionist, and he hates evolution. And so, I get a lot of Christians who attack me for pointing out Genesis in its Hebraic context does not contradict anything with regards to the theory of evolution or scientific origins of humanity. And so they attack me because they're like, no, Adam has to be the first man. He had to have been created literally from dust. And I'm like, okay. So I get attacked for that kind of stuff.
Was that the gist of G-Man? I don't even know what G-Man was trying to argue against. What was he arguing exactly?
He was just trying to tell me that his English Bible says Adam lived to 930, therefore Adam had to live to 930. And I was like, well, what does the cultural context suggest? What does the actual context of the biblical text suggest? It suggests these people did not actually live to these ages. It suggests that these were symbolic numbers. They were meant to give honor to the ancestors, not actually be their literal ages.
Now, there is the Christian kind of wariness to the accepting of evolution that I think is due to, I guess, more the narrative of Genesis, where death is a consequence of sin, and that if Adam had not sinned, then there would not be death. So for there to have been evolution prior to Adam's fall, then that would mean that there was death prior to actual sin occurring in the world.
Right. Well, the problem is with that, and I've pointed out this numerous times, is Genesis 3 tells us what that means. God never curses their bodies in Genesis 3. He never changes their bodies. He basically just curses the ground and kicks them out of the garden and says, well, now you can't have access to the tree of life, so you're going to die. So that should tell us they were already mortal. And the only thing that made them immortal was access to this special tree that God had created. So how did death enter the world? Or how did death spread to all humanity? Well, they lost access to the tree of life. That's the actual story. It doesn't actually suggest their bodies changed. And Paul even seems to indicate this in 1 Corinthians 15. Because he says, we have a body like Adam has, and he says our bodies now are corruptible, perishable, they're doomed to die. But Christ has a different body and will be resurrected in these new bodies. So that implies that Adam's body was already perishable, prone to corruption. That, it was without the tree of life, Adam was going to die. And so God never curses their bodies. He just removes the tree of life. Okay, they were mortal then.
Right. Yeah, I read one of John Walton's books, and he seemed to have the idea that the story of Genesis was about God kind of ordaining Adam to be his first priest. And I guess by giving him access to the tree of life. And so if he's in contact with the tree of life, then if he's continually eating from it, then he would be able to live forever.
Right.
Okay. What is your kind of perspective on what the tree of knowledge of good and evil is?
Well, I think it was a good tree.
Okay. Then why do you think God told them not to eat of it?
For the same reason you don't let your toddler drive your car right now. They're not ready for it. So there's an interesting parallel. So God, and to go to 1 Kings 3, where Solomon is praying, and what does he ask for? He doesn't ask, he asks for wisdom, but specifically he asks for the knowledge of good and evil. He wants to be able to discern good and evil. So that's a very interesting correlation, and God grants it to him. Why? Because Solomon didn't seize it for himself. He asked God, and God granted it to him. So I think John Walton argues this, that God was going to give them access to the tree. It was on his timing and when he thought they were ready for it. So it wasn't something he was going to completely keep away from them. It was just, he wanted them to, get used to the rules, get used to the garden, get used to the way things were. And in the proper time, they would have been given access to this tree. Like Solomon had access to the same type of knowledge through God. So I don't think the tree was bad. I think what was bad is that they seized it for personal gains. And that's why when they eat from it, their eyes are open and they know, and they become ashamed of what they did. It's like they didn't get any sort of like supernatural thing. They just got special Solomon-like wisdom, which just made them aware of what they did and why it was wrong and everything.
So, yeah, I guess that would mean that, like, prior to the awareness of their own wrongdoing, there was no sin in the world.
Well, yeah. Well, let me ask. Yeah, to people we get. Well, how could there have been all this pain? Okay, so what is sin? Well, sin is transgressing the law of God. Okay. If God did not give any laws yet, there could not be no sin. So, for example, it was not a sin for Adam and Eve to eat bacon because the Mosaic covenant didn't exist yet. So it wasn't a sin yet. So, it was a sin for Moses, but not for Adam and Eve. So if God did not reveal himself to humanity yet and did not set up a covenant with Adam and Eve, there could be no sin because there was no law to transgress.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. Go ahead. No.
Oh, that broad springs reminds me of an interesting question that I just remembered. In one of the debates you were just in, I think it was the G-Man debate, you mentioned that this isn't the perfect law of God as written down in the Old Testament, and you referenced something in, I think it was Matthew 19, where Jesus is talking about why God allowed people to get divorced. I thought that was a really interesting point. Do you remember exactly what I'm talking about?
Right. So a lot of atheists get upset because the Old Testament law is so evil. How could a loving God give it? Well, we have to remember, from God's perspective, he wasn't happy with it either. So Matthew 19 directly tells us that the law of divorce was given because their hearts were hard. So it was a compromise. If you think of raising kids, I can't tell you how many times I compromise with my daughter. Like, honey, just eat one vegetable, just one, and then I'll give you a lollipop. It'll be, please, just one. I would prefer she just eat vegetables, but that's not going to happen. So I have to compromise because she's not at a place yet where she can understand that. That's the same way the Mosaic covenant was kind of set up. It was God's attempt to move humanity to a better place. And then when the new covenant comes along, it's God moving us to an even better place. So Matthew 19 directly tells us that, but there's also places like Numbers 27, where these daughters go to the tabernacle and they say, look, we want inheritance as well. And God says, that's a good idea. Okay, let's update it. Let's update the law so they can accommodate that. So God was willing to change the law. He was willing to update it. He did so in 1 Samuel 8 when he gave them a king. He said, this is a bad idea, but because you want it, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to compromise and give you what you want, even though it's a bad idea. So when people get all bent out of shape about the Old Testament law, you have to remember where it's coming from. God is not saying this is the perfect law that's going to be forever. He wasn't happy with it either.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a real, because theologically speaking, it's hard to argue that that's the perfect law of God because of the things that a lot of the atheists will point out. What's your take on the shellfish, eating a shellfish, misting of garments and things like that? Go ahead.
So you have to remember that. So Christine Hayes talks about this. She's not a Christian, but she did some really cool.
Yes, that's a fantastic series. By the way, everyone listening, Yale Old Testament series, Christine Hayes, fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, she notes that some of these are arbitrary, and they are for a good reason. So if you're going to create a culture that it's going to remain distinct and for generations, you got to do a lot of weird things that are going to cause you to be distinct, like avoiding certain foods or doing certain weird rituals that sort of stand out and keep yourself distinct. That's why the Jews even exist to this day, whereas other cultures have come and gone. They have such a unique rituals they perform to keep themselves distinct. and they were meant to be distinct until the Messiah came. And another thing is with these dietary laws, they have a symbolic purpose as well. They're meant to represent order. So you don't eat ostrich because it's a bird, but it doesn't fly. So it symbolically seems like it's in the wrong place. You don't eat lobster because it's supposed to be in the water where it's supposed to have fins and swim around, but it has legs. So it should be on land. So it symbolically seems like it's out of place. You don't eat certain types of carnivores because they eat rotting corpse, or they eat rotting flesh. And so every one of the dietary laws or the ritualistic laws are meant to represent order. We're not doing these things because we want to show how much we care about an ordered system. And so that's the purpose behind them. They're arbitrary, but they're arbitrary for a good reason. Just like, you could kind of argue that baptism isn't really necessary to be saved, but it symbolically represents the idea of becoming a new person. Yeah,
exactly. It's a symbolic, right. It's not anything that's theologically, it's not contingent in any way theologically. It's just something that symbolizes your new life in Christ. That's a great example, actually. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
In her particular thing on the book of Leviticus, she mentioned also there are ritual sins and then there are moral sins. And there's a cleansing ritual to get rid of the ritual sins. And I thought this was really good observation, really on point, because a ritual sin is something that just happens. Like it's incidental. You can't avoid it in life. Like you're walking down the street, you see the hot girl, and you're like, oh wow, that's a ritual sin. It just sort of comes with the territory. Whereas a moral sin is part of a moral failing. It's a decision of you, and it's more important. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, there's a clear distinction, because I think in Deuteronomy 14, God says, don't eat these certain types of foods, but you can give them to the sojourner or the foreigner among you. Okay, well, if eating these things was immoral, why is God saying it's okay for the Canaanites to do this? God kicked the Canaanites out of their land because of their immorality. But then he says they can do things that the Jews also weren't allowed to do. So there's clearly a distinction in the type of ritualistic commands versus the moral commands. God wants all humanity to be moral, but the Jews had a specific calling, a specific purpose, so they had a bunch of rituals to go along with that specific purpose and calling.
How much comparative religion do you know? Do you study other religions too, or do you have?
Right now, I'm studying more ancient Near Eastern religious ideas. So, like Ugaritic inscriptions, Sumerian religion, Babylonian religion. I'm studying more of that. I actually read a little decent amount of Egyptian religion as well. So more ancient religion. More about.
For example, the Ganges River in India. That's a purification ritual. That's why they think that river is holy, and that's why they go to it all the time. There's purification in Hindu. I don't know anything about it. I was just curious if you did. But there are purification rituals in other religions. That's a common idea. It's not unique to the Old Testament. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean like it's a sin or anything. It's a ritual you do to show your commitment to your religion, to your God. It's meant to show, you symbolically, take this seriously. The same thing.
You are separating yourself. You're sanctifying yourself. And there's a covenant, but the people are doing stuff to declare themselves more symbolically. We are in line with him, this being.
Right.
But it's a symbolic ritualization, and it's trying to establish a connection through your activities. So the connection is in the real world, because you're actually doing something to establish your sanctification process.
Right.
Symbolically.
That's basically what it is. Exactly. Yeah. These are not sins. And so this is when I debate people like in the Hebrew roots movement, I have to try to explain this to them.
And how does the explanation go? Because if you don't really think about this stuff, it doesn't really occur to you. It seems all nonsensical unless you start actually thinking about where it's really coming from. How does it go when you try to explain it to people?
Well, I kind of did what I explained to you here. I basically explained, look, God was willing to compromise on a lot of these laws. And you can point out the difference between the ritualistic aspects and the moral aspects. God calls all humanity to be moral, but he doesn't call all of them to eat clean food. as that's pretty clear. So you could have explained that kind of difference, and then you explain the New Testament verses that, now that God wants all humanity into the family, now that the Messiah has fulfilled this covenant.
Right, but it's hard to explain something that complex to someone who's trying to beat you in a debate, because it's just hard to that's my point,
It would depend on the person I'm debating and where they're coming from. I mean, everyone's going to be different, and my strategy is going to be different regardless of who I debate.
Oh, that's true. Okay, that's true. So you don't know anything about the ritualization process in Hinduism, for example. So I got to find a book to read on that.
No, I'm not too up to date on Hinduism. I've read a little bit in the past, but not as much as I could have.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking with your idealism and everything existing within the mind of God, that has some I don't know, Eastern feels to it. I think Brahma is supposed to be the overall creator God, and everything that exists within the mind of him, I think.
Right.
Yes.
But it also has some Greek Orthodox feel to it, because there's a lot of the same ideas in the Greek Orthodox theology.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do you know Jonathan Pajot at all?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. We're going to try to get him on the channel, right, John? We got him. We can probably go up the food chain.
That's a good idea. Yeah, we'll have to do that.
Let's try it. Email. We got this. He's up the food chain. We can go up the food chain, get the higher ups. So that'll be our next big get.
Yeah, he's a Greek Orthodox icon carver, and he does a lot of videos describing the symbolism of the biblical stories, and even the movies and things like that. That he ties in Adam with Batman in one of his videos. It's pretty interesting stuff.
You saw The Matrix, right? Speaking of, and the Christian symbolism in there. Do you see it? Do you lecture on it? Did you do a video on it?
No, it makes me think more of Gnosticism, because it's.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh.
What happened?
I think
he quit.
I think
I knew he was going to run when I asked him that. I knew he was going to get scared and bail.
I knew it. Somebody unplugged from the Matrix. I'll make sure.
Oh, how weird is that? We just started talking about the Matrix, and then he picked up the phone and disappeared.
One of those synchronicities. All right, let me make sure he has the.
Was that your fault or his fault?
That's not mine. I didn't do nothing.
I'm pretty sure it was your fault, John.
Okay,
either that or he just got intimidated because I started pressing him too hard.
I'll take the fall for it. Don't worry. I'll wind it up to user error on my part. Let me make sure.
Well, I can't take the fall for it. I wasn't doing anything except asking challenging, important questions, groundbreaking questions. That's all I was doing, John. Asking groundbreaking questions.
Exactly. Let me make sure it looks like the YouTube channel is still, or we're still live streaming. Oh no, but there's no video. Oh, he's back. Okay.
You guys there? I don't know what happened. I think I just got kicked out.
I thought you got scared because I started asking about the Matrix. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. But you don't have to own up to it if.
I don't know. Apparently, I just got kicked out for some reason, but I'm back.
Sorry.
Did you do a video on the Matrix?
No,
Yeah, I guess it is more. I guess it is more Gnosticism. It probably follows the entire Gnostic creed, right? It's almost the entire idea of Gnosticism.
Yeah, it's secret knowledge that gets you out, that kind of stuff. So it's very much the theology of the Matrix is very similar to Gnosticism. Mm-hmm. There's these evil people that control the illusion we live in. All that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also kind of that tied to Gnosticism of what we do in this world doesn't really matter, because all that matters is kind of the afterlife and where we're going to be going.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm pretty sure that there were Gnostics who kind of used their Gnosticism metaphorically, and they didn't actually consider it, it wasn't a real religion in the sense of Christianity. Just as there are Christians who are reached that point nowadays that are more like in England they talk about this type of these watered down Christians who don't really believe any of the tenets of Christianity necessarily. They're kind of more cultural at this point.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, those tend to be more extrinsically religious people. Yeah.
So, John, are there questions from the audience?
Oh yeah, we got quite a few. I have a couple questions of my own that I was like kind of collecting as we were going.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think actually in your video on hell you mentioned The Great Divorce from C.S. Lewis. Is that right? Okay,
oh yeah, very much.
Because I actually read the book after you had mentioned it, and that was like extremely eye-opening for me. It was really great book for anybody that wants to read it, to kind of get a different perspective on hell than you might have had beforehand. And it's real short too. The interesting thing about that is Tom Jump that we mentioned earlier, in one of his videos, actually debates on objective morality. He kind of described his own idea of what objective morality is, and like the best possible world is one where every single consciousness is able to create their own universe, and they get to do whatever they want inside their own universe. And something about that just screams so much of C.S. Lewis's usage of hell, whereas
exactly,
yeah, like everybody can be inside their own world, create exactly as they want, but because they have to be around other people, like instead of being around other people, they have to kind of go further and further and further apart to the point where like hardly anything of themselves exists. And I found it so funny how exactly the kind of atheist, secular, Sam Harris type perspective for the best possible world is one in which every creature is capable of enacting whatever will that they desire, is basically the exact same thing as hell. So I don't know, like...
Well, it makes me think of, if I would have gotten everything I wanted when I was in high school, I would probably be pretty miserable right now. I mean, I look back at some of the things I wanted, and I'm like, if that would have happened, that would have been horrible for me. Because do people really know what they want, or do people just think they know what they want, and it tends up to not really be what they want?
Right.
So,
I would have been dead. I would have been dead if I got anything I wanted when I was 20.
So when people say that, it really shows a limited understanding of human psychology and, philosophy of what it means to be human. If you think the best possible world is where you get everything you want, you just haven't thought that much about it.
Yeah, it's almost like the cardinal sin of making oneself God and instead of actually God. So that's yeah. All right. The other thing I wanted to question. Okay, so in like your usage of quantum mechanics to kind of support your arguments for God, I see a lot of the time that atheists and materialists will kind of like a go-to response to that is that, well, consciousness isn't actually required for the wave function to collapse. All that's required is some sort of measuring tool that's there, even without a conscious agent there being aware of it.
Yeah, that's not actually true. That's true in a pragmatic sense, but the philosophical implications are still there. So the reason why... So first of all, there have been interaction-free experiments that have been done, and the results are the same. There still is collapse. So if there's no interaction, why are we still getting collapse? I even did a video on the interaction-free experiment back from the 90s. So I did a video on that specific experiment. And then there is still the existence of the measurement problem. So a guy named Maximilian Schlauhauser wrote this very long paper on the measurement problem and why interaction just doesn't fully explain it. And then he goes through all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics and how they try to explain it. And when he gets to my interpretation, kind of orthodox interpretation, he just goes, well, philosophically, a lot of people don't like this because it means we have to posit something outside of the natural universe. And we want to just try to explain everything in its own terms. And I'm like, well, there's your problem. So no, the measurement problem is still there. It's still a real problem in physics, and just this hand waving in a way and trying to say, well, it's all just interaction. You need to get more up to date on the data and the research that has gone into that.
Okay, and it seems like the book that you referenced quite a bit is the Quantum Enigma. Is that the one that you would suggest for people to read?
Right, and the reason I keep suggesting that is because it's written at a kind of a layman level, so you get they explain a lot of these things very well.
Okay.
Well, give us 3 books for quantum mechanics and Christianity. Quantum Enigma.
A Christianity.
Well, what we're talking about on the topic that will help us.
So the Quantum Enigma, the Ghosts in the Atom is good. That is that's based on a bunch of interviews that Paul Davies did with different physicists and their different interpretations. So you get a good understanding of all the different interpretations. And Rudolf Peers presents my interpretation in that book, and he does a really good job. Another good book would be Modern Physics and Ancient Faith by the physicist.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's the one I was trying to look up. I think you've had that written somewhere.
Yeah, that's another good book.
An Ancient Faith.
Just check out papers by Henry Stapp. He has a lot of really good papers on the subject.
And the TED Talks. There's like 15 TED Talks on this subject now, and they're all worth checking out, or some of them are. Go ahead. What are some of the audience questions, John?
Okay, yeah. Let's see. I've got a question from SJ, I guess in reference to your debate with G-Man. Like, what do you think the age of the people were prior to Noah?
Average human ages like we have now. I don't think they have to be these exaggerated ages. That just doesn't seem to be scientifically possible, and it's not necessary when you read the text. So,
okay. Yeah. So what about those after Noah then, like that have a somewhat, I don't know, it seems somewhat exaggerated, at least for our own time, like living up to 120, or I think, is that Joseph?
Yeah, I don't think they had to. I mean, Joseph ironically gets the exact ideal age in all of Egyptian mythology, which is 110. And so it's just an odd coincidence. Moses gets like the exact ideal age 120 in Israelite ideology, or not ideology, I guess, theology. So be the better term for that. So it really, I mean, these are just sort of ways to sort of like give honor to their ancestors and explain that in a certain way. And they're doing mathematical formulas and mathematical patterns on purpose. So they're trying to get exactly 12,600 in between Adam and Moses, from Eden to the Promised Land.
So is that then tied to the Jewish gematria of the like numbers connected to like each number having some sort of symbolic reasoning behind it? Okay.
Very much so, yeah.
All right. Yeah, okay. And we got a question from Defending Christianity. Does inspiring philosophy believe in once saved, always saved?
Oh, that's a good question, actually.
I don't know. That's a difficult question to ask. I don't get into a lot of the theological disputes because I don't.
You're not God. You're not God.
Yeah.
I'm not God, and I don't really care that much.
Yeah, that's a good response. Yeah. Okay. Do you have a take on religion as an evolutionary adaptation? That's from Think Club.
Yeah, that's a really standard Think Club type question.
You know,
it's a good question.
If he interviews me, we can talk about that, because there's actually a lot of really interesting research on this idea. And you remember, I was reading Jan Osman recently on, what does the Bible fit more? Does it fit more with like a revolutionary monotheism or an evolutionary monotheism? And that's really interesting to go into. I think religions do evolve. I think Zoroastrianism is a great example of religion evolving over time. I think, of course, the Bible, of course, talks about evolution of religion. I mean, the Mosaic Covenant is an addition added in, and that is an evolution. Then the New Covenant comes along, fulfills the Old. That's an evolution in a sense. Mm-hmm. So,
I would look at like the different sects of Protestantism as sort of like diverging species of Christianity in a sort of way.
Sure, there's different ways to interpret it. It depends on what he means. Do I think the ancient biblical authors, like Moses and Abraham, were polytheists? No, I think they may have been henotheists, but I tend to think they were more monolateralists with implicit monotheism. So they were, they understood what they were talking. If they were going to use our language, they would describe themselves as monotheists. But because we're using their language, they would describe themselves as monolateralists, which means they worshipped one God.
I think he was meaning more like the very like practices of religions and even like the beliefs in God as being some sort of like evolutionary
adaptation.
Yeah, in order to bind groups together into something.
I actually do think that. Yeah, I very much do hold to that view. And I hold to it for the same reason that I don't see that as a problem for my theism, for the same reason that humans evolved to understand mathematics and science. If God really did create humanity to get to a certain point, he would create in them he would create certain natural laws to sort of constrain humanity to eventually come to understand the divine as well. So just like, we've evolved to understand science, we've also evolved to understand the divine, I would say. And so to have specific cognitive faculties that God could reveal himself to us. So I do think the understanding of religion has evolved to some extent. The question is, which came first, polytheism or monotheism? In my view, it might be a little different on that.
So you think monotheism might have come first?
Yeah, I'm going to do a video on it, and there's some interesting data I need to go over. But yeah.
All right, cool. Because I don't know, it seems like the common thing I see around is that it kind of starts off as animism, and then polytheism, and then monotheism, and then okay, cool.
If only I could talk about what I'm researching now, but I want to save it.
All right, cool.
John. Wait, let me ask one question before you get. What's your take on for example, the idea that Satan was developed out of Zoroastrianism, and that Christianity borrowed from some of the texts of the time?
I don't think that's hard to really argue, because all of our texts from the Zoroastrian religion, like the Avesta, date to after Christ. So, there was a lot of problems with it. A lot of the Zoroastrian texts were burned or lost, and they had to rewrite literally everything. And so a lot of scholars that specialize in Zoroastrianism argue that, it's the other way around. They were actually borrowing from Christians and Muslims to compete, because they didn't want to go out of existence. So we don't really know. I think Zoroastrianism was more polytheistic in its original form. But
so what's your accounting of the evolution of Satan from the Old Testament to the New?
I'll do a video in September on the serpent in Genesis 3 coming soon. And so I don't think the Christians had to look anywhere beyond the Old Testament to get an understanding of Satan.
Okay.
And so I think that's what they did. I don't think they had to look to other religions. It's there, but it seems like it's more revealed in the New Testament. So yeah, I'll do my video on Genesis 3, and I do think that is Satan in Genesis 3, and I'll explain why and what's going on there. There is a cosmic battle happening in Genesis 3. It's subtle, but it's there.
And you also think it's Satan in Isaiah, 12 or 14? I forget.
Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 20. Yeah. I don't think Satan is actually in the book of Job, though, because when they talk about Satan in there, they use a definite article. So it's not a name. They're talking about the Satan, the accuser. And that's someone on God's side. He's kind of like a guy that works for God.
Okay. So interesting. Then the serpent and the adversary in Job are different characters then?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. All right. I got a question from Epic Christ. Are you familiar with Eric Wildner's version of moral realism?
No.
Okay. He has. I looked it up while you guys were talking. I guess he appeals to the existence of non-natural brute moral facts. So kind of like in the same way that theists might have to say that God's existence, being his essence, is kind of a brute fact about God, that instead of having to have any sort of foundation outside of itself, moral facts are similar to that. So I'm not sure exactly how, but
it's possible. I would need to look more into it, but when I look at those kind of brute fact idea, I just see my video, is God the same as the good? I think that just implies a personal source behind it all.
I see. So, I wonder if it would also, I know there's some theistic arguments that all propositions have to be based within a mind, just because they hold informational value to them. So if you're positing a moral fact such as rape is wrong, that kind of contains informational basis to it. So I don't know how that could be structured without some sort of mental, metaphysical underlying reality to it. All right. We got a question. Do you believe Aaron Ra will ever accept the true definition of pistis?
No.
Oh, that's a hilarious question.
At this point, no. I mean, it's really sad, but I mean, it's also so uncharitable. And here's the analogy I kind of try. I would wish he would listen to. He likes to say to him, atheism is a lack of belief. Okay, fine. If that's what it means to you, fine. I don't care. You get to define your terms and what you mean by this. If I'm debating an atheist who says, no, atheism is the belief that God doesn't exist, okay, I'll use your terms then. Whoever I'm talking to, I'll use the terms you want. I don't care. Why can't he do that as well? If some Christian comes up to him and he goes, I don't need evidence, I have faith. Aaron, free range, go after him. You're right. In that situation, it means a lack of evidence. It means rejecting evidence. But if you're talking to me, please use my terms and what I mean by them. Let's be charitable. Let's use the principle of charity here. So if he can't do that, there's no use talking to him.
Right. Well, what the problem with what he's doing is that faith is actually used differently in the Bible than the way he even said in your debate that he's only going to use it one way. So he's just trying to win a debate. He's not trying to actually understand a Christian's belief organically from how they actually perceive it and act upon it. Because when faith is used in the Bible, a lot of times faith is used as something different than just, when atheists use it, they almost always mean radical assertion without evidence. Well, it's used differently in the actual Bible. Like Jesus says, your faith has made you whole. You know, that's more your trust, your obedience. It's also used to denote obedience. So it's used differently. And he just refuses to even engage the other ways because he doesn't really want to understand and fully know what we're dealing with. He just wants to knock it down. That's my take.
It's really unfortunate. And, you know, as I said, I will accept his definition of atheism. Why can't he do the same for us? And, you know, to be fair, some Christians won't, and they insist on giving him his definition of atheism. And I don't agree with that either. Can we just agree, you know, we're going to be respectable adults that are going to debate, that we're going to at least accept what that person is saying and asking? And if Aaron had Eric Jimenez on his channel recently, and I watched that debate like this the whole time, I was like, he is just not being charitable. He's not being fair. He's not listening. He's trying to tell Eric what he believes and why he believes it. This is preposterous. Like that's the word that popped into my head. I was like, this, like, how do you do this? Just like
this is balderdash. It's balderdash.
If Eric says, I believe in the soul, let me tell you why. Don't tell Eric why he believes in the soul. Let him explain. But Aaron couldn't even do that, and it was that's another interesting question. I didn't make it all the way through that one either. It got to be too much. What is he talking about with his thing on the soul? That it's like the ancient peoples couldn't differentiate between the wind and a spirit. So every time they use wind, they mean spirit. That's why, you know, vodka we call it spirit. But what on earth was he talking about? That's the first time I've ever heard that idea. No, it's not entirely wrong. So because a lot of ancient people knew we had to have air to breathe, but you couldn't see air. Some of them, like it's in an Egyptian text, that they thought the air we breathed was spirit. So this is not something that's he's entirely wrong on. It's a lot of ancient people did think that the breath was the spirit because it doesn't look like matter, but it's in us. Mm-hmm. And so it may be some sort of ether thing.
Now, it kind of makes sense too. Like if you see a corpse, it's no longer breathing, but someone that's alive is breathing. So like there's something that's missing there.
Right. And so there is something to that. Now, but here's the thing. In the biblical text, when they talk about nephesh, sometimes it does mean breath. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it means someone's vitality or reason to live. So they use it metaphorically, like, you know, what gives you breath? What makes you breathe? What drives you? So there is some distinction sometimes. There's a really interesting scholarship on it that cannot just be reduced to, well, it's all breath. It's a lot more complicated, but nephesh doesn't also mean soul either. So when the biblical authors were talking about the nephesh, they didn't mean soul. So they didn't mean that the breath was the soul of the person. It's a lot more complicated than these quick, you know, fortune cookie sayings people try to reduce it to.
Yeah, some of the stuff that he goes into just seems so like, it's almost like interpreting the Bible. I see this almost similar to how Richard Carrier goes about it, like through interpreting the Bible through a very materialistic lens of like, or a scientific lens of what we think of now. So like he like tried to portray the pillar of fire and smoke in Exodus as, oh, that's obviously just indicating a volcano. And,
yeah, exactly. I remember that. He specifically said that, yes.
Which doesn't make sense if a pillar of fire is coming down from heaven and leading the people towards where they're supposed to be going. Like, how does a volcano do that? Unless it's supposed to be used as a metaphor maybe of like a volcano in the distance that you're moving towards. But
yeah, it didn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense at all. But also the soul, I mean, this part of the reason why people think that there's a soul has to do with you experience you. I actually made a video I'm going to post pretty soon. You experience you as something that is essentially you, more than just the sum total of your thoughts, feelings. You know, And it's really hard to wrap your brain around the idea. Atheists say it's easy to wrap your brain around the idea that you die and it's just like before you were born. Oh, you just don't exist. It's really hard for people to wrap their brain around that. That's where the idea comes from, I think. Michael, you say
it's a little more complicated, and it's not all ancient people believe the same thing. So
right, I'm just saying from a layman.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it too.
Mm-hmm. All right. I had a question of my own that I wanted to bring up just because this is kind of my thing. I did like a 50-minute video on it at one point of like, have you heard of the term metaphorical truth? That's something that's kind of been going around in the intellectual dark web or whatever it is. Kind of meaning as opposed to like a fact-based thing, it's I guess a metaphorical way to perceive something or to imagine something that is more helpful than the factual, like real understanding of it. Anyway, the question is, do you think that there's that religions are primarily based more on the metaphorical truths rather than the realistic factual truths? I'm guessing probably not from your position.
No, I don't think so. I don't see how that would be helpful in the long run.
Yeah, so it goes into like the evolutionary argument for religions is that these fictional stories that were useful in helping these distributed tribes kind of coagulate together into a unified tribe, that they had a story that could hold them together, was something that would be evolutionary advantageous for them to bring about. The element that at least reminds me of some of the stuff that you go into is how pastors will use the biblical stories in relation to their own current situations and to try to make a metaphorical connection between past and in reference to their own environment as it is today. But anyway.
That's a long topic to go into.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's quite big.
You're more of a conservative Christian. When you did a conservative Christian test with Pine Creek, where he asked you all these questions, I was surprised at how much more of a by the books Christian you are than I thought you were. Does that make sense? You would describe yourself as more of a conservative Christian, right?
I guess so. I mean, I affirm core Christian doctrines and the reality of the past. I do think Adam, Eve, Noah, Cain, Abel all existed. Whether those were their actual names, I don't think it matters. Like, for example, I think Nimrod in Genesis 10 is actually Sargon of Akkad, and Nimrod is sort of like a nickname for him. It means like that rebellious one. So maybe some of the names in the past were like nicknames, like later Hebraic nicknames. But I don't think it really matters in turn. But I do think they actually existed.
How much of the numbers stuff do you actually know? Do you know how they deal with the sacredness of numbers and things like that? The significance?
Yeah, there's a lot of significant sacred numbers that they want to use and rely on. I mean, Matthew's genealogy is a core example of that.
Okay.
Let's see. I had another question. This is actually a good one from Ivan Lopez. I think this, like, in reference to your, how did you call it? Dualistic idealism?
Dual aspect idealism.
Dual aspect idealism. Yeah. What do you think about people who suffer from multiple identity disorders? Do they have multiple consciousnesses? And if so, are they responsible for all their actions? And if on Judgment Day, who's held accountable for the action?
No, they have multiple personality disorders. So it's not multiple consciousness disorders. So typically, I was reading, there's a great chapter in the book called Irreducible Mind where they cover a lot of this. And there are some alleged hearsay cases from like the 1800s where people allegedly had two consciousnesses once, but a lot of that has never been confirmed in other patients as well, and we never actually had clear documentation of it. So these are multiple personality disorders. So there's always a conscious agent behind that person that might be switching in between the different personalities. Some of the personalities could sort of be like autopilot setup in a sense. So some researchers have talked about this in that So think of like when you dream and you talk to people in your dreams, those people aren't real. They're products of your own mind. So the mind is obviously able to create other personalities you can interact with. Those personalities could just be other personalities in that sense. So it's a very complicated issue in and of itself, but I think there is still a conscious agent behind that. And this is why
conscious agent.
Singular conscious agent. And this is why people or psychologists that work with these people try to unite the personalities into one. And that shows that, there's still a conscious agent that's switching back and forth, could be switching back and forth between different personalities. Who's going to be judged on Judgment Day? I mean, we're not judged by our actions. We're judged by our faith in Christ and our grace that Christ offered. So I don't really worry too much about that kind of stuff, because it's not like God has got a checklist up there for everyone to get into heaven.
So what about the splitting of the corpus callosum, where it seems as though there are two subjective persons there that are experiencing the world differently from one another and answering the questions differently. So even though the right hemisphere has no verbal ability, it can still make indications of what it saw or what it's pointing to or something like that with the left hand. Yeah,
I would argue that could be explained under something called the switch model. I talk about it in part 2 of my Case for the Soul series, where they kind of show that these different alleged split brains are actually one unit, and the conscious agent is just switching back and forth between the different hemispheres. And so because the information is disconnected, it seems like there's two different people, but there really isn't. So if you want to see more, check out that video. And there's a lot of studies that I cover in that video which show this.
But if it's happening at the same time, would the soul be able to switch back and forth between them, or one after the other? Would it have to be here for a few seconds and then over there for a few seconds and then back and forth?
Yeah, and there's a lot of flimsy evidence that there was actually going on at the same time. It's possible, but again, it could just be sort of like that autopilot thing I mentioned as well. So, sometimes I do things when I don't. How many times have you driven somewhere and then don't remember actually getting there? You were thinking about something else. So your conscious self was somewhere else, yet somehow your mind was still driving the car.
Right.
And so there's that happens in people now.
Okay. Because there's this, I wish I had the title of the interview, but there's this interview with someone with DID that she has a 4-year-old personality, a male personality, and then her own personality. And from her own explanation, it's as if they're occasionally she's able to see what the other personality is doing with her body. Other times it's she uses this analogy of a car. Sometimes you're in the driver's seat. That's when it's her personality, the one that's at least speaking. Sometimes you're in the passenger seat. Sometimes you're in the back seat. Sometimes you're in the trunk of the car and can't even hear what's going on.
But it sounds like there's still a conscious agent. There's these autopilot personalities kind of going on.
Right. Okay. So you would assume then that there's only still the singular conscious agent, which is whatever the personality is that is relegating that experience that they had. But all other actions are committed by non-conscious agents, like philosophical zombies then?
Possibly, yeah. I would recommend the book Irreducible Mind for more on that, because that's one interpretation. And then again, there's also, when you get into the peer-reviewed data, that kind of idea gets a little bit more flimsy in how powerful these other personalities really are. So check out the video I did on that. It might help a little bit more.
Well, if we're going off of Christian idealism, there's at least the possibility that a singular mind or conscious agent is capable of sustaining multiple conscious agents or consciousnesses within itself. So if at least for God, he's able to have my conscious experience and your conscious experience sustained within itself, it could at least still sticking within that model, a singular conscious agent could have its multiple branches, perhaps, that is only able to experience one thing. So your hand's subjective experience of what it's touching, along with your other hand's subjective experience of what it's touching. If I was to only be the nerve endings for this one hand, I'd only be able to feel a certain amount of qualia within myself. But my larger consciousness agent has kind of an aggregation of all of those qualia and experiences. But anyway, that's
I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. but there's a substance dualist that I disagree with, or that we get in interactions with on Twitter. All right. Oh yeah, and do you accept or are you aware of Reformed epistemology?
Yeah, Alvin Planting is Reformed epistemology.
Is that tied to like Reformed Calvinism at all, or is it just
no? It's something different. It's about epistemology basically. So that's a whole subject in and of itself.
Okay, yeah, yeah. It seems like at least there's a lot of work put into it, but it's hard to get it. I recently bought the Alvin Plantinga's, or I guess kind of his legacy book, 24 or so arguments for the existence of God. And that is just a nightmare to have to go through, at least for somebody like myself that is not familiar with like the abstract symbolic logic and all the terms that they're using that are very, very much within the philosophical framework. But it's going to need probably some sort of glossary or something for me to really get much out of it.
Oh yeah, I know.
By the way, did you read Edward Fazer's 5 Proofs?
No, I've not read that yet.
Okay.
It's pretty good. He goes into the Thomistic arguments as well as like, so he has Aristotle, the argument for like proposition as like having. Quiet, Craig.
What?
You're being too loud. Yeah, and also, yeah.
Being too loud to what? What are you talking about?
You were like moving the microphone around. Yeah. Anyway, it's a good one, especially to go into the like early medieval philosophy of the arguments for the existence of God. And actually, Ed Fazer had a recent debate with Dr. Graham Oppie on
capturing Christianity.
Right. And that was pretty good. There were some technical issues, and it seemed like they didn't get very far, but it was certainly interesting to see where it was all going into.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Next question if you want.
Yeah. What does Mike think about Molinism? Can you explain that?
Yeah, Molinism is basically a kind of like middle ground between like Arminianism and Calvinism in a sense, like looking at God's knowledge specifically, though. So it's like, yeah, God did predestine things, but he predestined from his middle knowledge. And in his middle knowledge is where all the feasible possible worlds are. So these are only worlds where, you can, where God works with free will. So maybe there's a possible world where, so maybe God looks at me and my free will and all the choices I could make in the future. And there are no possible worlds where I would ever choose to be a Muslim. So that world would not be feasible in God's middle knowledge. But he would pick from the worlds of his feasible middle knowledge. He would pick the actual world from there. But he would pick the best of all possible worlds. So the argument would be that everyone who's going to hell is going there because there was no feasible possible world where they would choose the good regardless. And so I did a video called The Omniscience Paradox Debunked last year. It was in November. So I explain it more, and there's graphs and there's charts, and explains it in a much easier way.
Okay. So wait, if God's the one picking which of the possible worlds that he's enacting, would that be in contradiction to man's free will then?
No, because he's picking from the feasible possible world itself. So we are still choosing in that world because God selected it. So it kind of tries to work with the whole predestination free will thing.
Okay. So like maybe like he's choosing the map and then we're the characters on the map that are acting it out. And he, okay, with at least like kind the knowledge of,
yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. There was another question right here in the chat.
I do need to get going pretty soon.
Okay.
Though,
Yeah.
I was going to say we got a few more questions and we'll wrap it up.
Right. Okay. I think that was all. Okay. If God is all knowing, can God experience things? So I'm guessing like in kind of a temporal sense, is God able to experience things?
Yeah.
Like that?
He just knows what he's going to experience because knowledge and experience are not necessarily the same thing. So he just knows what he's going to experience. Now
there's, I hear sometimes that if God is outside of time, he's unable to have any sort of temporal experience. Would that just be worked around by, I guess, Jesus as being the Word of God inside time that's able to enact within.
No, because remember at the baptism, you see that all the members of the Trinity are in time. It's Jesus is there, the Holy Spirit descends, and you hear the Father speak, and he has to be in time to do that. The way the early church got around this was talking about something called the energy essence distinction. So God's essence is his timeless nature. That's the transcendence of God, but he's also immanent, and he's immanent through his energies.
So is that tied to panentheism then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the Palamite panentheism.
Okay.
You just did a video on panentheism, didn't you?
Yeah, a while back. Yeah.
Okay.
So that would be like God is capable of emanating his essence through the world that we experience then.
Right.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's the end of the audience questions. I had one more, I think, that I wanted to go over before you head off.
Okay.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on panpsychism then, especially in relation to your idea of, I guess, idealism there?
No, well, panpsychism is kind of a different view. It tries to say that, like everything is everything has an element of consciousness. So every atom has some sort of element of consciousness. And then our consciousness is sort of like built up of these smaller elements of consciousness. So it still is a reductionist type view. And so I don't hold to it whatsoever because I think consciousness is irreducible and fundamental.
I see. So there would just be the consciousnesses and then other things that don't have consciousnesses just as the experience for the person. So like a rock wouldn't have any reality outside of its existence within a conscious subjective experience somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, under panpsychism, rocks are conscious to some sense.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's it. That's all the questions that I had collected.
All right.
Well, that was pretty awesome, my friend. That was almost exactly what I wanted. We went through a lot of the stuff that you cover, a lot of stuff that you debate about, and I thought we got a pretty good, thorough accounting of kind of like picking your brain, trying to figure out, the advantage of having you on a channel is you do a lot of the work, and then we just ask you questions and we learn.
Sure, yeah, that works for me.
So that was cool. Hopefully we'll have you on again, and and you can actually, if you want, give us ahead of time things that you want to talk about. And then we'll give you, opportunities to, we'll do this again with more structured, where we'll pick some topics that you want to go into, and then we'll just discuss them.
If you guys want to do it, just schedule it with me, and I'm pretty good from there.
Oh, because one of the things we didn't cover was, I know you've mentioned in some of your videos the A and B theory of time, which I still don't know anything about yet. So that'll be one.
Okay. Yeah, we could talk about that in the future. Sure.
Yeah, that would be a good one. Yeah. All right.
So this was awesome. We'll have you back on. We'll go into other topics. And
all right.
John, you want to say goodbye to our guests?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. You've been, a great resource to go through. Everyone go subscribe to Inspiring Philosophy. His channel is quite the good collection of Christian and theistic arguments for people to.
It's honestly, I think it's the most thorough and the best Christian apologetic channel out there. Outside of mine. Mine is better, but his is almost as good as mine. Mine isn't thorough at all. Mine is just like, I feel like talking about this today. Research, sure. But no, his channel is honestly the best. I'm pretty sure it's the best. There are a couple people who are good, like Michael Heiser, but his channel isn't as good as Michael's channel. Michael's channel is the most thorough, and it's 8 to 15 minute videos. It's video friendly. It's not like you have to watch 3-hour things to get the benefit of all of his research. So it's the go-to channel for Christianity. It's a must. It's a must subscribe.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah. And it's great too. Like your short videos that you have on just like the ontological argument, the moral realism, different things like that. Like you can search it up. Yours is one of the top videos up there, and you can just go watch it, get a good idea of what some of the basic arguments for and against it, and get a good understanding, especially from a Christian perspective on all that.
Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted it to be, so that's good.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to get a thorough, like, beginning knowledge of a lot of these different subjects by just clicking on one of your videos on it. It's perfect.
Right. So, anything you want to plug, like some of the future of your channel? Like you were saying, you were going to go into Genesis 3 more.
I'm going to do a couple videos. I'm going to get to Genesis 6 before the year is out. So I'm going to do a video on the Nephilim before the year is out, but I'm not going to argue it has anything to do with angels. So I'll be bringing up Heiser a lot because I'm going to be responding to some of his arguments. Because I'm so unconvinced by that. But then I'm going to do some videos on monotheism. I'm going to do some videos on the flood. After that, I'm going to redo my series on the soul. So I'll do a whole new series on the case for the soul, and because I found out a lot of more evidence and data I put into it. So that's what I got in the works right now.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you much. And we are signing off for the night, kids.
Sure.
You heard it here live. Inspiring Philosophy. You hadn't heard him before, now you know who he is. And